Welcome. I'd like to welcome everybody this evening to really a landmark Owen J. Roberts lecture. We're celebrating a very special moment here at the law school. In the past few weeks, which really projects Penn Law over the next 50 to 100 years and embodies our intellectual ambition and our future. The formal dedication will occur in April when Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor will be here presiding. But even as we celebrate that achievement and where we're going forward, we remain steeped in our traditions, which really are the basis of that success. And one of the grandest traditions here at Penn Law School is the Owen J. Roberts Lecture. Today, I should note, represents a watershed. We're passing the half-century mark in the Roberts Lecture, over 50 years. We launched this lecture series to honor the memory of one of our most distinguished alumni. Justice Roberts epitomized the Penn Law ideal. He bridged the worlds of academia and public service, serving on the Supreme Court during the Depression as a very well-known special prosecutor of the Teapot Dome scandal, and returned here as a professor and later as dean at the end of his accomplished career. When the great man died in 1955, four then recent graduates and members of our Order of the Coif approached Dean Jeffrey Fordham and proposed the law school create an annual lecture series that would bring leading figures to campus. It really is a pleasure to recognize these four individuals who are now distinguished alumni in their own right, who are with us this evening. Harold Kramer, the Honorable Thomas O'Neill, the Honorable Norma Shapiro, and the Honorable Dolores Sloviter. Welcome. We also, I should note, are indebted this evening to Justice Roberts' law firm, Montgomery, McCracken, Walker, and Rhodes, who stepped in about 35 years ago and came forward with a wonderful endowment to endow this lecture. And then recently, I have to commend them, they put together the exquisite brochure which shows 50 years of Roberts lectures, as well as sponsoring a reception. So I would really like to thank that firm as well. And with that, as they say, I'd like to go to the videotape and show you a brief video about the founding of the Roberts Lecture. Well, as they say, the rest was history, 50 years of history. What makes the Roberts Lecture so exceptional and secures its place in Penn Law history is, of course, the quality of the speakers. And as Judge Sloviter said, the first Roberts Lecture, the inaugural Roberts Lecture, was Judge Felix Frankfurter. But the list of subsequent Roberts Lectures really is a who's who of the legal profession and the academy. We're truly honored that three of those lecturers are here this evening: the Honorable Arlen Adams, the Honorable Lewis Pollack, and the Honorable John Gibbons. It's wonderful to see you here, all of you. Now, the list of other Roberts honorees included Supreme Court justices and legal luminaries such as Antonin Scalia and Henry Friendly, Solicitor Generals Erwin Griswold and Archibald Cox. The list goes on and on. They all share one enduring quality. They're major thinkers and contributors to our fundamental understanding of legal and policy issues in the American Republic and elsewhere. And today's speaker, it really comes out of that same cloth. We really could not have chosen a better figure for this occasion than Michael Ignatieff, who embodies the virtues of Owen J. Roberts. Like Roberts, his career personifies the twin pursuits of knowledge and public service. He squeezed many lives into one, shuttling from Canada to England to the United States, both as a student and a provocative public intellectual and humanist, whose contributions to liberal thought have elevated the discussion on human rights and international relations and have had an impact. He's held senior academic posts at some of the finest universities in the world, including Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, and the University of Toronto, all of which he has attended. He's authored 17 books on human rights, on international relations, on ethics, as well as memoirs, biographies, and novels, garnering awards that are really too many to mention here. He's produced award-winning documentaries exploring the impact of nationalist movements around the world. He's jumped into the rig of politics in his native Canada, where he made a prodigious rise as leader of the Liberal Party in opposition to the ruling Conservatives. And finally, he's dodged incoming fire as a war correspondent in the Balkans. By any measure, this is a life in full. I think Michael has put it best, describing himself as a, quote, cosmopolitan with a thirst for adventure. He did not have to look far for inspiration. His family history is worthy of a mini-series. He's the son of a Canadian diplomat who served 4 prime ministers and a descendant of Russian counts who served in the Tsarist government. Members of his mother's family laid the route for Canadians' transcontinental railroad and played critical roles in creating the country's modern education system. Michael is best known for his commentary and work on human rights, particularly for advocating Western intervention to prevent genocide, as he did in the aftermath of the humanitarian crises in Kosovo and Rwanda. And perhaps most significant, he took action as one of the drafters of a foundational document, The Responsibility to Protect, which called for intervention in future humanitarian crises, such as the one that occurred in Libya. During this period, Michael gained a highly visible platform for his work when Harvard appointed him director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, an academic think tank attached to the Kennedy School of Government. In that position, he became world-renowned as a human rights scholar and advisor to several world leaders. In his 5-year tenure from 2000 to 2005, he turned the Carr Center into a dynamic intellectual salon, infusing it with crackling energy. He embraced nation building, implored strong nations to flex their muscles on behalf of the weak, and re-examined the meaning and context of human rights on the world stage. As one admiring scholar put it, quote, he threw a grenade into the whole debate on human rights. And then, 2 years after 9/11, he surprised colleagues by declaring his support for the US invasion in Iraq in a much-read and debated essay in the New York Times Magazine. Despite his call to action, he was very circumspect about the commission, as he observed at the time, to support the war means remaining distinct from the company you keep, supporting a swift and decisive victory while maintaining your distance from the hawks, the triumphalists, the commentators who mistake machismo for maturity. A couple years later, he decided to reinvent himself again, choosing to run for office in his native Canada. In 3 years, he vaulted from a backbench member of the House of Commons to leader of the Liberal Party. And he became a very serious contender for prime minister, propelling a bold, progressive vision, what he called an affirmation of Canadian possibility. It was an exciting moment when the ideas and vision of the economy were truly translated into a focused public debate and action. Ultimately, moving out of politics, he has now returned to academia as a senior resident with the University of Toronto's Massey colleges, where he teaches courses in political science as well as law. In so doing, he really has come full circle, like our own Owen J. Roberts, who returned to Penn Law School as dean after a life of significant service, though I must say, my guess is Michael has a number of future acts after this. While he did take a somewhat different path than Roberts, Michael resembles Roberts in his commitment to scholarship, to legal education, and education more generally, and to civic leadership. His fascinating career has truly defined what it means to be a public citizen. Owen Roberts would have been so proud. It's therefore my distinct privilege and pleasure to launch the second half-century of the Roberts Lecture by presenting to you the 2012 Roberts Lecture, Michael Ignatieff.
Before this talk, I was talking with the dean and realized that the last time we had been together was at Walpole Maximum Security Prison in Massachusetts. And I leave this audience to imagine how a future dean and an ex-politician managed to meet for the first time in an American prison. It's a story we will tell you afterwards, will we not, Dean? There we go. You've done me a very great honor in asking me to give this lecture. This is a great law school, and I accepted with alacrity, and then I read who'd given the lecture before and realized with some alarm that you'd set me a very considerable challenge. And I just want to thank you for the honor, and now I have to meet the challenge. I want to talk about matters that relate to my experience in politics, and I hope we have a good discussion afterwards. My subject is standing in law and standing in politics. In law, standing is the doctrine that judges use to establish if a person has a right to bring a case before them in a court of law. The case law in standing enables judges to determine who gets their day in court and who doesn't. Standing identifies who has the right to be heard, but it also defines the jurisdiction of the court in such a way as to keep the boundary clear between judicial authority and legislative power. Americans tend to draw this boundary more tightly than we do up in Canada, where a limited public interest case for standing is granted to third-party interveners. American judges, and I'm honored that there's so many of them here in this room, and it makes me slightly terrified, I might add, but American judges, as I understand it, usually deny standing for third-party interveners and public interest suits that would draw courts into what American judges regard as political matters best left to elected officials. In adjudicating standing, judges have to balance the right of every citizen to equal access to the law against the democratic principle of limiting the jurisdiction of the courts. The enduring point of contention in standing cases, as I understand it, is whether an individual or group's right of access to the law is to be sacrificed on the altar of judicial restraint, or whether judicial restraint is to be sacrificed in the name of equal protection. When we move from law into politics, a similar conflict emerges between using law to ensure that elections are free and using the law to ensure that political standing is equal. All citizens want our elections to be free and fair, but not all citizens believe that the law should be used to guarantee equal standing. Our battles over these issues are fundamental because they're battles about the balance that we should draw between conflicting principles at the heart of our democratic faith. We all accept that there should be a boundary between judicial and political authority. We just don't agree where that boundary should lie. We all believe elections should be free and fair, but we do disagree about whether and how far to use the law to equalize standing. And so we live democratic life together as a set of structured disagreements about reconciling democracy's competing principles. Now, there are two dimensions to the idea of political standing: the right to vote and the right to seek public office. And the law has been used to equalize access to both. Women, blacks, and in my country, Aboriginals were once denied standing in politics, no more. Property and age qualifications have been swept away. And as the law has opened the doors of standing for some, public opinion has closed the door on others. Overt racists, misogynists, homophobes no longer have standing to seek public office. Felon disqualification still prevails, but here too we disagree about what democracy requires. It may be obvious that a citizen should forfeit their liberty upon committing a crime, but it's much less obvious why they should forfeit their right to vote, especially not when we're talking about such a sizable class of largely black and minority fellow citizens. Formal discrimination may have been abolished in politics, but over felon disqualification and other matters, the battle over standing in politics remains a ferocious one. Parties right now in this election year are fighting to deny standing to each other as voters. The latest example being voter ID requirements, which according to the Brennan Center at NYU could be used to disbar up to 11% of the American population their right to vote. The requirement to present a government ID in order to vote can effectively be used to deny people access to the ballot box. Battles over the right to stand remain as contested as battles over the right to vote, and in what follows in this lecture, I want to talk exclusively about battles over the right to stand. In this area, the battle over political standing as the right to stand for office, the key public issue and area of contention is money. Money power ever more completely determines who gets to compete for public office, not just here, but in lots of other countries. Here again, we disagree as citizens about what democracy requires. Money, many conservative thinkers argue, is speech, and law should not be used to regulate speech. And the law should not be used to equalize the economic playing field in the battle for political office. Why? Because to do so would sacrifice liberty on the altar of equality. The law's role in democracy ought to be confined to preventing fraud and discrimination in the electoral field, but once this role is fulfilled, let robust competition of free market of ideas determine who wins. Now, my perspective on these issues, and the reason that I've taken my life in my hands and raised this as a subject with you, is that I spent 6 years in elective politics. I'm one of the few people who thinks about politics for a living who had the temerity to actually seek and hold political office. I ran in 3 elections, won 2, lost 1, and this lecture attempts to tell you what I've learned. And I think what I discovered is that politics has largely become a battle over standing, defined as the right to get a fair hearing. Establishing your standing is the critical condition for electability. If you don't establish this first, and if you allow your opponent to define you and to deny you standing, nothing you say, nothing will get you a hearing. Now, what's interesting about this process is that the rules that determine standing, in this sense of the word, are nowhere written down. They're in the realm of the tacit rather than the explicit, and this puts all of us, but especially citizens, at a disadvantage. So my purpose this afternoon is to help us all understand one of democracy's hidden rules. But let's begin with ideal theory. According to an ideal account, any citizen should have the right to represent any other, and the choice ought to be decided through free dialogue and persuasion. So in our democratic ideal of standing, it's built on twin foundations: the sovereign equality of citizens and the sovereign equality of our reason. Now that's pretty exalted stuff, and in real life we know that voters aren't very sovereign and they aren't very reasonable. We're talking about ourselves here. Yet thanks to the living inspiration of democratic ideals, we are not reconciled to the democracy we have, and we're not reconciled to the citizens we have become. And this discontent with what democracy is, this discontent with the gap between what it is and what it could be, is critical if we're to make our system fairer. To understand how standing is earned in politics, we need to realize, I think, first of all, how voting has changed in our lifetimes, or certainly in my lifetime. Standing was once accorded by allegiance to institutions and the validation they provided to particular candidates. As these allegiances fragment, so have the authorities that once conferred standing. Voting behavior, as you know, is more volatile than ever, party loyalty is less stable, and electoral choice more individualized. Voting is less an expression of allegiance and more of a marker of a passing mood or feeling. I think we forget how important political allegiance once was in defining the personal identity of citizens. American families kept photographs of FDR on their mantelpiece. In Canada, the photographs were of Laurier and Macdonald, our great prime ministers. In France, it was Clemenceau and de Gaulle. In Britain, Lloyd George or Churchill, or even Clement Attlee. When I was in politics, I didn't see many photographs of political leaders on people's refrigerator doors. Political candidates battle for standing, for the right to be heard, in a profession that has more power than ever, but less authority and legitimacy than ever. Ingrained distrust of politicians is a sign of health in any democracy, but we are way past distrust and into a kind of permanent miasma of malign suspicion. This atmosphere, I think, has something to do with the decay of institutions that once provided candidates for office with the validations, testimonials, endorsement, and other rituals that conferred standing and helped to break down the mistrust that fastens on anyone who first seeks political office. The institutions that used to shape electoral preference, clubs, unions, women's organizations, and political parties, have lost their capacity to deliver voters and hence their power to confer standing. Standing means not just speaking for someone or earning the right to do so, as well as speaking to them. And one of the things that is startling when you're in political life is that you can no longer take for granted for an instant who you have the right to speak on behalf of. I mean, to give you an example, once there was something called the women's vote, when two-parent families and stay-at-home mothers were the norm. Nowadays, modern women would be insulted if you were to presume to read off their electoral preferences from their gender alone. Once there was a union vote, but unions now are too weak to deliver blocks of support to any party. Work itself is fragmented, and the big battalions of the organized labor movement have been disbanded. Unions do endorse candidates, but endorsement does not deliver votes, because endorsements no longer confer standing. Individual union members decide for themselves. Similarly, I think you could argue that race is losing its salience as a permanent marker of political preference. There's still a black vote because there are still black office holders who depend on it, including a black president, but that black president is far too savvy to assume that they will vote for him on grounds of race alone. There used to be an immigrant vote that cast ballots according to what local leaders suggested they should do. Today, when a candidate seeks standing with these groups by associating with those leaders, he quickly discovers that new citizens vote like anyone else. That is, one individual at a time. If you look at the media, the big newspapers whose endorsement used to matter, the key columnists whose coronation of a candidate used to make all the difference, have lost their power as media platforms multiply and audiences fragment. Everywhere, voters vote as individuals, if they vote at all. And something is shifting in the relationship between political and personal identity. As they value their own personal identities more, they value their common identity as citizens somewhat less. And so they vote less often. Voting is losing its meaning as a symbolic statement of civic attachment, and it may also be losing its relevance as a declaration of collective interest. To argue that people still vote their interests is to assume their interests are fixed, and these fixed points, in my experience, are now gone. In the new electoral landscape, voting is driven by emotions, intuitions, and fears, shaped primarily by the media imagery cascading out of our screens. What's interesting about this is that individuals ought to feel empowered by the disintegration and weakening of the power brokers who used to determine standing. And the amazing information that's now available at all our fingertips ought to have given us an even greater sense of political power to determine standing. But most voters that I've met do not experience anything like empowerment in the new world of electoral politics. The disintegration of mediating institutions has left them feeling disengaged. And we know this because voter participation rates in most societies have fallen from somewhere in the mid-70s to the low 50s in a generation. Voter attention span is short, and the competition for it is ferocious. We forget that, of course, before the coming of radio and television and the cinema, politics used to be the chief spectator sport of a mass society. You can't even understand the photographs of the Lincoln-Douglas debates without seeing this was the greatest show in town. No more. Politics now competes with an almost infinite list of diversions, real and digital. The political meeting, a wonderful institution of our public life, and the pleasures of pressing the flesh that go with it, that's going the way of the circus. Politics now largely occurs in cyberspace, and voters make choices not between real persons, but between digital personae. And families that no longer have time to eat together certainly don't have time to formulate political preferences together. Democratic choice no longer occurs after collective deliberation or after a personal encounter with a candidate. It's made in front of a screen. And it's made so quickly that in the time that it takes to absorb a negative ad. This, in rough and brutal summary, is the modern world that an elected politician or someone seeking political office has to contend with. And the tools available to a politician to reach this disembodied voter are those that have been perfected by modern consumer marketing. Show a political operative your postcode, your date of birth, and the number of years of schooling that you have, and any self-respecting campaign can align a candidate's policies seamlessly with messages targeting an individual's preferences. We don't seem to notice that what's happened in the process is that what used to be an essential feature of politics, that is the formulation together of policy, platform, and vision for a country's future, is being displaced by micro-targeting to individuals. Issues cease to be rallying cries to unite constituencies. They become wedges to aggregate discontented individuals. And a modern politician can't reach this disencumbered voter by appealing to party, class, ethnicity, or religion. They can't even count on their party machines to deliver the vote. Every election, the machine, such as it is, has to be rebuilt from scratch. Party organizations, in my experience, are no longer mass organizations, that is, big tents pitched in the center of the fairground, but shrinking and often aged covens of partisan amateurs whose function is to get out the base and suppress the votes of their opponents. As party bases shrink, they cease being those big tent organizations in the middle of the fairground, and they come to resemble ideological covens on the fringe. This makes it more difficult for moderate politicians to get their voices heard. If they seek the endorsement of the covens, they lose standing with voters in the middle ground. If they refuse the embrace and endorsement of the covens, they may end up having nowhere left to stand. In the era of permanent campaign, without stable long-term party organization to count on, a candidate goes into battle choosing commanders from among the condottieri, the paid professionals who wage campaigns against each other for commercial gain. The professionalization of politics has accelerated the demobilization of the party volunteer, and professional operatives, bankrolled by the bundlers and the fundraisers, have created formidable new campaign techniques to deny standing. That's what they do. That's their job, to establish the standing of the candidate, to deny it to the opponent. And this dynamic, the professionalization of campaigning, the funding of it by bundlers, has contributed to an atmosphere of increasing meanness and negativity in electoral campaigns. And this is the atmosphere in which a modern politician has to achieve standing. Standing once delivered by institutions is now earned voter by distracted voter in a digital blizzard. And the task is to secure voters' attention and create sufficient authority to sustain that attention for more than a microsecond. And attaining that relation, that visceral connection with a voter, comes before anything else, and denying your opponent the chance to define you in the eyes of that voter is absolutely critical. So standing, once conferred by clubs, unions, parties, women's organizations, ethnic leaders, and newspaper editors, is now doled out by the backers and bundlers of modern campaign finance. In the wake of the Citizens United ruling in the United States, rich individuals can now bankroll, this is the new feature, a rich individual can now bankroll the entirety of a candidate's campaign and in effect determine who has the standing to run for political office. As everyone knows, certainly in this room, big money champions its power as a robust exercise of First Amendment rights. But in my humble opinion, the rights argument is a travesty. Money is not speech. It is power. And money power, if uncontrolled, will deliver democracy into the hands of the wealthy few and take it away from the many. American democracy has had to struggle against this problem through its entire existence, and those of us from other countries who love your democracy attend the result with some trepidation and anxiety. There has always been a battle to preserve equal standing against the power of money, and America will have to right the balance once again. The solutions may not be easy to craft in detail, and you would not expect a foreigner to give you any advice. But the principle is obvious in outline. Campaign finance reform that outlaws large donations of any kind from any source and forces all parties to compete on an equal footing from small donations from ordinary citizens. Of course, there's a balance to be struck between the promotion of rough equality in party finance and the protection of free speech and other rights. All I would say is that other democracies control the power of money without extinguishing vigorous, even rancorous, partisan debate. No one out there does it perfectly. But to insist that America is so exceptional that it has nothing to learn from other countries is, if you'll allow me to say so, to compound self-deception with willful blindness. Money may be power, and here's a complexity in the argument I want to emphasize. Money may be power, but significantly there remain, in this democracy and another democracy, limits. There remain limits to the power of money and to its sway. Money confers the power to stand, because it can bankroll candidacies, but it does not in itself confer standing with voters. Big money candidates recurrently lose elections. Businessmen recurrently discover that standing in commerce does not translate into standing in politics. The current Republican frontrunner is living that ordeal as we speak, and the outcome is uncertain. Only a personal narrative that reversions capitalist success as public service job creation or as a heroic rise from humble beginnings actually transforms wealth into standing in the democratic forum. Standing, it turns out, is full of paradox, and it's full of paradox in relation to personality. Good character, for example, does not automatically translate into standing. People recurrently support candidates whose character is uncertain. Each of you will have your own example. You can achieve standing without character provided you have a story that a voter will identify with and see a connection to. Standing is not reliably correlated with trustworthiness. People often vote for men and women whose trustworthiness is uncertain. And again, you will supply your own examples. Nor do popular figures always succeed in translating popularity into standing. People often vote for candidates who court unpopularity, and they vote for those candidates who are unpopular because the public likes a maverick with the courage of his or her convictions. So you can be elected without character, you can be elected without trustworthiness, you can be elected without popularity, but you can't be elected without standing. This is what makes this a complicated concept. To make matters more complicated, nothing you achieved in a previous life entitles you to standing. Education and educational qualifications, for example, do not confer it. Intellectuals, artists, writers, professors encounter exceptional resistance when they try to force their way into politics. Artistic, scientific, and cultural achievement are marks of elite status to most voters. And even voters with degrees often doubt that education entitles a politician to standing. The most famous writer in Peru, a Nobel Prize winner, in fact, Mario Vargas Llosa, returned to seek the presidency of his country, but his achievements, his patriotism, remarkable as they were, only confirmed to voters that he was an outsider, and he was soundly defeated. It's only when intellectuals pay for their convictions with a price that everyone respects that they achieve standing with their own people. Václav Havel, Martin Luther King, Aung San Suu Kyi, Nelson Mandela, they have in common, despite their different contexts in which they fought, is that they earn standing through the authenticity of suffering and sacrifice. Not their eloquence, not their learning, but suffering and sacrifice. That conveyed standing. Intellectuals are often shocked, to take the standing discussion a little further, intellectuals are often shocked that celebrities, sports stars, television personalities achieve standing in politics that eludes intellectuals. But this is because celebrities have mastered the very quality that determines standing, that is, the capacity to evoke strong identification among voters. The public who elected Ronald Reagan were indifferent to the argument that acting actually confers none of the experience required for governing. Celebrity generals like Dwight Eisenhower converted a military record into political standing, despite the fact that military command is often a poor preparation for leadership in politics. So political standing is a complex reality to understand. It cannot be claimed, but the fundamental rule is it cannot be claimed as an entitlement by virtue of previous service. It must be earned in the battleground of politics itself. And what must be earned is belonging. A candidate has to establish and defend a claim to be truly a member of the community he or she seeks to represent. To have standing is to be legitimate. To have standing is to belong. First-time candidates often believe that standing, in the sense of belonging, can be achieved by demonstrating mastery or ownership of a particular issue. What's puzzling and baffling about this is that issues are secondary in the battle for standing. Only a minority of voters decide standing according to the issues. Most people, in fact, feel comfortable voting for someone they actually disagree with, provided the candidate gives the impression of understanding their most important public preoccupations. And in making this connection with a voter, language that makes contact matters more than language that conveys mastery of policy. If a candidate turns a voter's question into an opportunity to display how clever they are and how much they know, the result will not establish standing, but most definitely the reverse, because it's connection, not mastery, that counts. Earning standing with voters means you tell them a story that connects your experience to theirs, and the story's punchline is always the same. I am one of you. The most famous living example of this, of course, is the current President of the United States, who took an extraordinary and very exceptional and unusual and even unpromising personal story and turned it into a story about America. And its punchline was, I am one of you. He was shrewd enough to realize that his curriculum vitae, Columbia, Harvard Law, and the Harvard Law Review, coded as class privilege. So he recoded his life story into a narrative about the high-achieving son of a struggling single mother. The critical moment in his battle for standing actually occurred in this city, in Philadelphia, when he had to give a speech to refute allegations of a troubling association with a radical and intemperate black preacher. Obama's famous speech about race was actually a speech about standing, defending his right to represent the hurt and pride of his own people, but also his capacity to understand the resentment of whites passed over in the name of racial justice. His challenge was to defend his standing with black Americans without losing his standing with whites, and with that speech, he established the joint standing necessary to become the first black president of the United States. But the story, of course, doesn't end there, because the challenge to his standing continued, and in some sense continues to this day, in the controversy over his birth certificate and the allegation that he was not actually born in the United States. Were this to be true, of course, he would have no standing as a candidate for the highest office in the land. So having failed to deny him standing on grounds of race, his opponents seized on the opportunity to deny him on grounds of citizenship. And fortunately, in my view, they failed in both occasions. The Obama case illustrates what battles of standing turn on, establishing that you belong, that you are one with the people you aspire to govern, while your opponents seek to turn you from an insider into an outsider, from a native into a stranger, from one of us into one of them. Carl Schmitt, the highly controversial but brilliant political theorist in Weimar Germany, famously said that politics is a battle of inclusion and exclusion, and its defining terms are friend or foe. And so we live in a democratic society that may explicitly outlaw discrimination, but nonetheless maintains a complex code that allows race, class, education, and citizenship to be used to turn fellow citizens from friends into enemies. The best that can be said about this battle is that despite all the money, all the black arts, all the negative advertising, the voter still remains the arbiter of the contest. And in the stubborn democratic instinct that standing is not an entitlement, but a privilege to be accorded by citizens and earned from them, I think there's hope. It is the same hope that Abraham Lincoln was referring to when he asked rhetorically, why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? We can read that as a piece of empty and inspiring rhetoric, but it contains the hard truth that we have no other corrective to our politics than our own political wills. It is the saving grace of democracy, indeed its defining property, that the right to rule must be earned in the trust and confidence of ordinary men and women. At the same time, however, there are legitimate grounds for concern when our brokerage institutions are so weak and our shared faith in politicians so degraded that the entirety of our politics is consumed by the battle for standing. In this battle, we seem to have forgotten a small but crucial distinction, the distinction between an adversary and an enemy. Holding on to this distinction is what reconciles political competition with common citizenship. Holding on to this distinction is what makes it possible for adversaries to become allies in the business of common government. In political competition modeled as a contest between citizens, you do not question an adversary's standing, their right to be in the ring, their citizenship, their patriotic attachment, their motives, their good faith. Competition focuses on vision, platform, and ideas. But in the model of political competition that has all but replaced that civic model, politics is lived and understood as war. Your opponent is your enemy. Your object is not to defeat them, but to destroy them. So you question their standing, their right to be in the ring, their citizenship, their patriotism, their motives, and their good faith. And competition simply ignores vision, platform, and ideas. Its explicit goal is to deny a fellow citizen the right to a hearing. And this, I think, is where we actually are in the democratic politics of Western countries, and not just in this beloved republic. As I have said, we can use the law to control the power of money in politics, but I concede and agree that we would risk our freedom were we to use the law to ban the more viciously untruthful attacks that now set the standard in the battle over standing. Instead of law, we have to look to opinion, to gathering disgust at what unlimited money and unlimited partisanship are doing not merely to politics, but to our capacity to treat each other as citizens of the same country. Disgust among the public, disgust by you, is one source of hope. But another is a change of heart among politicians. What I learned in politics is that any person seeking public office always has two loyalties, though he may or she may forget one of them in the heat of battle. There is loyalty to party, and there is loyalty to the democratic system that keeps us free. And there are times when loyalty to democracy itself must trump loyalty to party and to self. When winning ugly would leave a stain of shame not just on the winner, but on democracy itself. In the end, politicians are citizens, and we owe such restraint as still remains in the battle for standing to the strength of their democratic conscience. Because none of us wants a democracy where elections become nothing more than referenda about who belongs and who doesn't, who's one of us and who's one of them, with the result decided by the most telling attack ad. If standing becomes the only question in politics, none of the questions the society has to solve will ever get fixed. Elections will become plebiscites of standing, while the real questions, who do we want to be as a people, what challenges must we solve together, will not be decided in electoral contests. Partisan competition is the lifeblood of democracy. Vigorous adversarial justification is the best known restraint on power. But we need to understand more clearly where partisan disagreement must cease and where common citizenship must be affirmed. We need a politics of adversaries, not a politics of enemies, a politics of program, not a politics of standing. We should speak up for the principles and ideas that matter to us, because what is at stake is not just our principles. but our very capacity as citizens to maintain a politics that shapes our fate and controls our destiny. We tend to forget that democratic politics is a Promethean enterprise. It's the enduring expression of the human desire to shape fate rather than simply endure fate. I know a politics of program has to win one day if we actually want to solve our problems, because politics is the only collective way that we keep faith with that Promethean fate, that collectively we master our lives together instead of simply submitting to it. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Let me just say, I thought that was absolutely wonderful, and I was trying to think who could have delivered a lecture like that. Somebody who had the depth of understanding of the political process through his academic history, but somebody who at the same time had faced the voters one by one, trying to establish their standing. And it was that combination, I think, that really established a true background vision about what the political process should be about. Of course, the question is how we get there. So that opens us up. I think we have a little time to answer questions and have a conversation. So I will call on people for you quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. My question is, if you say that the president is able to go from being out-group to in-group, or able to make himself someone with whom American citizens can empathize, would you agree or disagree that that's more likely to happen someplace like the United States than, let's say, in a European country? Where do you think someone like Barack Obama, an African American, could become president of the Republic of France or a prime minister of England? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think the answer is only in America. I don't think there's any question. I can't see it even being as easy in my own country. It cuts both ways here. I'm making an argument, and I don't know how far to push it. In European democracies, the mediating institutions that control standing are stronger, and they're gatekeepers, and they may keep an extraordinary individual like Barack Obama out more easily. So this cuts both ways. I both regret the decay of these mediating institutions, but let's be honest, it also made it possible for a guy to come right up the middle. He did not have to spend 30 years in Chicago ward politics. He spent some time, but not a lifetime. And it didn't file off all his edges. So the loss of these mediating institutions, the decline of party disciplines, makes it possible for someone like that to emerge. And then, in my model of politics, but he was very much on his own. He has to do it himself. He has to literally create himself and create that bond with the voter. I think it's more difficult in other countries. I would concede that.
Thank you. I see the force of your argument that the decline of intermediate institutions is contributing to a focus on candidate-centered, voter-centered, one-on-one politics. But I wonder if there isn't another significant contributing factor to the transition from adversary to enemy that might be even more important than mediating institutional decline. and that is that candidates like Barack Obama not only tell a story of themselves in which the voter can see his or her own story, they also tell a national story in which they hope the voter will see both himself or herself and the candidate and their aspirations realized. And if you look at Bush's speeches as well as Obama's speeches, their different stories of America are always part of the central part of the rhetoric, and they're very different stories. And it's arguable that the adversary to enemy is bound up with the fact that we have more polarized national stories that are being advanced in our politics due to increasingly different worldviews, not only about who's in, but what our fundamental values are. That may not apply in all contexts, but that the question is, does that play a role in the heightened polarization, the heightened sense that one's political opponents are one's enemies, along with mediating institutions, and what about the relative power?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good description of the ways in which issues and vision play into this personal narrative of connection that a candidate for office seeks to establish with a citizen. The kind of third mediating term is the country and the vision that you have of a country, and then the voter wants to, the story has no salience unless it is spoken by a particular speaker. You know, Mr. Bush incarnated a certain vision of America. Mr. Obama does the same. These stories become real to the degree that they have a speaker. And you're then saying these accounts are very different visions. They relate to very different core values. That may be true. I'm struck by a more perverse relationship, which is Sigmund Freud had a famous phrase which I've used a lot called the narcissism of minor difference, which explores the ambiguity that the smaller the real differences between people, the larger they will make those differences loom in their construction of their own identities. So there's a very complicated way in which we create a politics of enemies to magnify differences between adversaries. And it may be that some funny way in which we construct this opposition of national visions and exaggerate it for electoral purposes. And then find ourselves slightly surprised, if you're an American, that tears come to your eyes in the seventh inning when you all sing America the Beautiful together. I mean, you know, you find yourself surprised. You think you're living in enemy camps, and in fact you're living in one country going to the same ball game. You know what I mean?
Thank you. In listening to all the categories of standing that you mentioned, I have the feeling that you are talking only about candidates on a national level. Having served in elected office for 20 years here in Pennsylvania, starting on a very low level, just through the state level, my own candidacy would not fit into any of the categories that you mentioned. Except being a graduate of Penn Law opened a whole lot of doors. But don't you think there's a difference between, or as I hear you speaking of national candidates rather than talking to people on local or up to state offices, which is really more retail politics and doesn't fit into any of your categories?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. My political experience is much more limited than yours, and it was national office and running national political campaign. And I do notice when I talk to municipal councilors or provincial representatives, elected officials who are much closer to their voters. In some of our municipalities in Canada, and I think think it's true in the United States, you don't have party political divisions. You have contests, but they're not divided by party. And the proximity with the voter makes the encounters very real. You do it yourself. You know, it's face-to-face stuff. And that kind of politics retains a kind of immunity from some of this stuff that's why I think you're quite right to say, and it's something I think I should say if I take this further, that I should distinguish that I'm talking about national politics where you really, national campaigns are now really run on television and the internet. I mean, it's just much more a battle of images, very different, I think, from the level of politics that you're talking about. But that's a very useful comment.
Thank you. And you mentioned as a Canadian high school student while your election was going on, I watched the campaign and I noticed one thing that you now mentioned, that Canadians wanted to connect with somebody who shared their story. And anybody from a perceived higher class, such as from an Ivy League university, was immediately classified as an outsider. And so now you say, well, one way to overcome that is to find a way to connect with voters. Do you think there's any way in which we could make voters think past that? Is there any other strategy besides simply telling a story like perhaps Barack Obama did, and actually force voters to consider issues at a higher level and make the issues the real issue and not simply who wears the sweater vest?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have smart answers to it. All I learned about standing was you got to show up. I mean, it relates to the previous question. You got to be there, even in a digital world. You got to they got to look at you. They got to see whether you actually give a damn. I mean, really. I mean, they got to look you in the eye. All that ancient stuff that goes back to Athens is true. The question is, holding on to it in a digital age where they never see you and where you're very much just 90 seconds on their screen. You're raising a more fundamental issue is how we confront the enormous divides of class and education that make identification so difficult. I mean, I spent 6 years having to explain why I had a Harvard PhD. I honest to God didn't think it made me any better than anybody else. It's a fact. I take some pride in it. I rolled my sleeves up and got it. I earned it, I mean, what's the big deal? It's kind of what I kept saying, but it classed me as a rich guy. It classed me as a member of a tiny elite. And it was weird to live with it. I kept having to kind of apologize for Harvard. It was crazy. Can you imagine having to? Well, I walked into that one, didn't I? And my point here is not, feel my pain. Wasn't it awful? I'm delighted I ran. I took my lumps. It was a wonderful experience. I'm very positive about it. But I would say this is a real issue. It's a real issue. I mean, that's why I mentioned the Obama thing. Obama was very, very shrewd about seeing the ways in which his extraordinary academic achievements were actually a liability unless he could wrap them in another story. And then people were much more comfortable with it. It was a story of achievement. It wasn't a story of privilege. And I think that's what you have to do, a story of achievement, not a story of privilege. I mean, and it's not phony to do that. It's just a reversioning of simple realities.
Take a couple more questions.
Yeah. You mentioned how what matters to voters is their visceral connection with the politicians and not the politicians' mastery of or even knowledge of the issues. Do you think that's fundamentally a problem given that there's so many misleading or downright wrong ideas floating around? And also, could you talk a little bit about your experience in politics as somebody that obviously very much knows the issues and has studied the issues and how you've kind of been confronted with politicians who just quite simply don't?
Well, sometimes, to be honest, I didn't know the issues. I mean, I cannot tell you. I did more learning in 5 years in elected office and in any experience of my life, it's an important thing to say about political life at the national level. You have to be coherent on a range of issues, and issues of enormous complexity. I didn't feel I was the master of my file. I often felt I was struggling. That's the God's truth of the matter. I think I don't want to be misheard on this point that you raised, because I don't want to sound condescending to the voter. I don't want to say, oh, they're too dumb to know all this complicated policy stuff. I mean something subtly but importantly different, which is that these issues are complicated. Voters know they're complicated. Voters, by and large, have fairly good political judgment, no better or worse than mine or anybody else's. What they're really good at, what human beings are good at, is not policy, but judging whether a person is their kind of person. What elections turn on, therefore, is this evaluation of another person. We call it personality, but I'm trying to call it standing, because, in fact, the range of personalities that you can vote for is really quite large. But what they have to convey is a certain kind of authority that's premised on, I hear you, I know who you are, I'm with you, you can count on me, right? I mean, that electors have a very good basic judgment about. And so they kind of screen out all the policy. What they're looking at is, does this guy understand me? Does he understand where I am, right? And on that, they're the only judge there is what it comes down to. Issues, it's not that issues are unimportant, they just come after you've established that connection. I feel that myself when I'm watching the politics of other countries where I don't know the issues. The thing I focus on intently is, who is this person? Do I trust this person? Does this person have authority when they speak? And it's a judgment that we all make all our lives, not just in politics, but in everything we do. And we're all pretty good at it, I think. And on that, I think the future of electoral democracy actually depends. That is, our basic competence as human beings judging each other. And we're better at that than we are at policy.
Two quick more. Terry? Yeah.
The federal papers are full of the fears of the founders, some founders anyway, as to the power of faction. You know,
Yes.
one of the things they were worried about was, how do we design a system that can avoid factions taking over? And of course, they knew that they would, and they have. But then we have the factions, as you say, the interest groups, whether it's the ladies groups or the unions or whoever is the particular faction of the time. And you say, and correctly, I think, that a lot of those old factions have washed away. But you're very concerned about the influence of money as being in a sort of the new faction, and Citizens United as being a mistake. So what's the next faction? What's the next thing which helps to gather voters and to have them as something other than individual people sitting in darkened rooms looking at screens and making a choice which is almost random?
That's a great, it's great to bring Hamilton and Madison into the discussion. My wife and I were down at the National Constitution Center yesterday, and we're very surprised at how small James Madison was. That was an eye-opener. This great man I've admired all my life. I thought, who is that? Is that Madison? You know, it was great. And the discussion of faction is just classic on this issue. And I'm not sure whether I've got this right, but the institution that I would like to see reborn, and it just may not be possible, is the mass, broad-based, big tent political party in the center, using social media, using all the latest stuff, a mass-based political party where you're dropping $20 into the hat every time you go in, and that's what you do. A mass-based political party where you knock on the doors of your neighbors and reconnect politics to people's kitchens. The party that I had the honor to briefly lead was a kind of shadow of its former self and had been in decline for a long time, so I don't want to pretend getting back to the big tent thing is going to be easy. But what I would say about it, which people forget because parties have a bad name, is that at their best, they put people in the same room who would never be in the same room otherwise. The thing that was unforgettable about democratic politics as my wife and I lived it was we would walk into rooms and meet the most unbelievable range of our fellow citizens. My life as an academic or a writer was much more circumscribed socially and economically. I was suddenly in a world where I was with my fellow citizens, and it was an unforgettable experience and an emotional one. One that I didn't understand very well, and the results speak for themselves, but unforgettable, right? Unforgettable. So you want to rebuild, if you can, that kind of mass-based big tent somehow, because otherwise you hand politics to these professionals. Politics becomes kind of what goes on in a darkened room between a screen and an individual voter. Parties can have a wonderful effect of kind of moderating your convictions. When you come in, you think, oh, that stupid idea, and then you go in and you listen to someone say, well, actually, in my region, it's God's truth and makes perfect sense, and you kind of scratch your head and say, okay, well, deliberation, in other words, what Amy Gutmann, President Gutmann, wrote so well about it. It actually, I've seen deliberation go on in these broad big tent organizations. And when they do their job, they're just critical to the future of our democracy. So I don't want to privilege the political party, but look, there are going to be, thousands of new mediating institutions created by the internet. I mean, there's one I watch very particularly at the moment, which is avaz.org, which has 6 million adherents on its website, and it is basically brokering the relationship between citizens in zones of safety and the poor citizens of Syria who are getting bombarded. So there are going to be a whole range of new mediating institutions, but the one that I care about, that I would love to rebuild and have some stake in the future, is just building those broad-based, middle-of-the-road, tents in the middle of the fairground.
I've got one last quick question, and then we'll break for reception.
My question relates to your last theme, namely the revival of political parties. Are you prepared to will the means? The means are getting rid of things like primaries, giving special financial incentives for political parties so that they're funded by the state, contemplating removing adversarial politics, having proportional representation so you get more consensuality even though you have multiple boring and more anonymous leaders. Are you willing, in other words, to propose the institutional changes that might actually assist parties' revival?
That was a great question, and the straight answer to that question has to be yes. I have to will means. And it's a very important point that this old friend and distinguished professor of political science, Brendan O'Leary, has forced upon me. Yeah, if you're committed to revival of the political party, then there are a lot of other institutional entailments then follow. And in my country, it looks like proportional representation. In my country, it will look like some public funding of political parties, particularly to strengthen their research capacities, their capacities to, German political parties do this as a matter of course. It's not, there's a whole set of institutional entailments, some of which you mentioned. But it does have the difficult consequence that you have to give power back to parties. That's the key point you're making. You have to give power back to parties so it's worth joining them. People don't join parties just socialize and have the unique experience of democratic deliberation. They join parties because they matter and they have power. And you got to give them back power, and that will have certain negative consequences. But I come to think that those consequences are worth us doing, because I fear the alternative, which is just the sort of disaggregation of the democratic experience. So it's just, you know, me and the screen in the dark.
Michael. Let me say, I think the topic of this Roberts lecture is as fundamental as any Roberts lecture we've heard, and constitutive of all the other decisions that go on in our society. I was thinking about Justice Roberts as you were giving your talk and answering the questions, and he was somebody who clearly believed in his movement of his career in connecting the academic with the judicial, but as well as serving in not elected office, but administrative office. And it's from that sort of combination of perspectives that I think a lot of his greatness came, and what has been the centerpiece of this lecture over the years, which has brought some of the most foremost figures in law and elsewhere to Penn Law School. But this has been a wonderful launching of the next 50 years of the Roberts lecture. And I think you've really given us something to think about and talk about as we all have drinks downstairs in the Great Hall, which I all welcome you to.